name is Clara Barton, but I prefer to go by Clara. I have been asked by the viewers to tell my story. I will start with my earlier life and what inspired me, and how I ended up on the front lines of the Civil War, and how I later went on to become the founder and president of the American Red Cross. I was born in Oxford, Massachusetts in 1821, and I am the youngest of 5 children. My father was a prosperous farmer, state legislator, and a veteran of the Revolutionary War. I loved hearing his stories about the war as a child, and looking back, I know that's why I felt so comfortable being on the front lines with the soldiers. My mother was a firm believer in women's rights and taught me that all people should be treated equally. Those lessons were responsible for many of the decisions I made throughout my life. My parents were active Universalists, and they helped founded the first Universalist church in Oxford. I didn't have a lot of formal education. The majority of my education came from my older siblings. My sisters taught me math and English and arithmetics, and my older brothers taught me lessons that you couldn't get in school, and lessons that a lot of women didn't have, such as carpentry and athletics, and they even gave me a job as a clerk and a bookkeeper. One of my biggest role models growing up was my aunt. She was a midwife who provided care just like the doctors of that time. I think that hearing her stories are what initially inspired me to want to care for others. When I was 11, my brother David fell and was injured while working on a barn. The doctors didn't hold out much hope for him, but I cared for him for 2 years and minted him back to health. It was then that I realized I wanted to devote my life to helping people. The values I learned in church, my father's war stories, and my aunt's devotion to women in need are what inspired me to give back. There weren't very many women in the medical field at the time, so my dreams of being a nurse were put on hold, and my parents encouraged me to become a teacher. I started teaching at a small school in town when I was only 15. I really enjoyed it and was actually quite good at it. And after 12 years of teaching, I founded and was the headmaster of the first free school in New Jersey in 1852. It started off small, but eventually there were over 600 students enrolled. I was happy there, but when the school board hired a man for twice my salary, I resigned. In fact, I believe my words were, "I may sometimes be willing to teach for nothing, but if paid at all, I shall never do a man's work for less than a man's pay." The next picture is of the free school that I founded. After resigning from the schoolhouse, I moved to Washington, D.C., and I became one of the first women to work for the federal government. I worked in the U.S. Patent Office as a recording clerk, collecting the same salary as my male colleagues. It wasn't easy. They constantly harassed me and tried to get me fired. But luckily, I had a boss who recognized my talents and my strong work ethic. Fortunately, the position there didn't last long. A new Secretary of the Interior came along and I was demoted. And then when Buchanan was elected, he fired all of his opponents, outspoken supporters, including myself. I had to move back home to Oxford. And unfortunately, I became very depressed. When I'm not working, I'm not well. So I decided, to get a job helping out friends and family in their homes, but I wasn't really helping enough and I was miserable. The next photo in the video is a photo of the patent office that I worked for in Washington, D.C. When Lincoln was elected in 1861, I returned to the patent office in Washington, D.C. That's where I was when the Civil War broke out on April 12, 1861. 1 week later, the 6th Massachusetts Infantry was attacked, and I was one of the first volunteers to arrive at the Washington Infirmary to care for the wounded soldiers. I recognized many of the men, and I felt an urgency to care for them. I began mending wounds and collecting food and other medical supplies. As the need for care and supplies grew, I quit my job at the patent office, and I began my lifelong career of aiding people in times of conflict and disaster. Many of these men had nothing but the clothes on their backs, and something had to be done. I started collecting supplies from anywhere I could. I called everyone I knew to donate, and eventually had 3 warehouses full of food, clothing, medicine, and other supplies for the troops. I didn't have any formal nursing training, but I did anything and everything that I could. The Time I spent with the troops made me realize that the greatest need for care was on the battlefields, and I was determined to find a way to get to them and give them the care and the supplies that they needed. To mention, but the previous picture was an illustration of me providing care at the infirmary in Washington. But moving forward, in 1862, I was granted official permission to transport supplies to the battlefields. I was at every single major battle in Virginia, Maryland, and South Carolina. While on the battlefields, I did everything I could. I cooked, I tended to the wounded, and I even wrote letters to families of the soldiers. I was referred to as the angel of the battlefield. And in 1864, I was named head nurse at the Ex-Corps Hospital in South Carolina by Major General Benjamin F. Butler. Unfortunately, I became seriously ill while in South Carolina and eventually had to return to Washington, D.C. The next photo is of me providing care on the battlefields with the soldiers. Once I returned to Washington, I was not ready for my work to end, and I needed to find a new way to help. The time I spent with the soldiers gave me a wealth of information about the men and the regiments they belonged to. Whenever possible, I recorded the personal information of the soldiers I cared for. I would often correspond with family members of the missing, wounded, or dead. In 1865, Lincoln selected me as the general correspondent for the Friends of Paroled Prisoners. It was my job to respond to anxious inquiries from friends, families, and of missing soldiers by locating them among prison rolls, parole rolls, or casualty lists at the camps. In order to accomplish this daunting task, I developed the Bureau of Records of Missing Men of the Armies of the United States. In this effort, we researched the status of tens of thousands of soldiers and answered over 63,000 letters. My final report to Congress in 1869 stated that we had identified 22,000 missing soldiers. Physically and mentally exhausted from the war, my doctor suggested that I travel to Europe for some rest, but I could not rest. While in Switzerland, I met the representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Over the next several years, I learned about the Treaty of Geneva, which set guidelines for humane treatment of the wounded in wartime. I returned home in 1873 after learning of my sister's illness, and I spent the next several years struggling with my own mental illness. After I was well again in 1877, I began my crusade for the ratification of the Treaty of Geneva and establishment of the American Red Cross. I built support and spread awareness by writing pamphlets, giving lectures, and meeting with President Rutherford B. Hayes. Finally, all my hard work paid off, and the American Red Cross was established in 1881, and I was named president. Most of our efforts focused on disaster relief, such as the Johnstown flood and the Galveston hurricane. The American Red Cross also provided international relief, helping victims of the Russian famine of 1892 and relief to Armenians living in Turkish-controlled Armenia in 1896. I was the president until I resigned in 1904. As I mentioned earlier, my spiritual influences were my parents and their beliefs in equality for all, and the lessons I learned growing up in the Universalist Church. I was inspired to care for others from hearing the stories of my aunt who was a midwife, and it was after caring for my older brother that I found my true calling. The people that I've cared for throughout my service were always those in crisis. They had diverse spiritual needs, and I was willing to do anything in my power to meet those needs. The people that I cared for during the war and the victims of disaster need all of the obvious things like medical attention, food, and clothing, but their spiritual needs are much more complex than that in times of a crisis. A lot of these people just needed to feel safe, and sometimes all they needed was a non-anxious person or presence. So sometimes I would just sit. When they were ready to talk, I provided a listening ear and provided support and connection. These people are lost and lonely, and they feel guilt and shame. They needed to be reminded that while their lives may never be the same, they can be stronger and better as they learn from their experience. They needed to know that someone cared about them and what happened to them. People in crisis need help restoring control over their lives. I prayed when I was asked to, and I never argued their beliefs or tried to persuade them to believe as I do. During my service, I fell ill multiple times. I did not suffer from compassion fatigue. I suffered from quite the opposite. When I'm not helping, I become depressed. The best self-care for me is to be busy helping others. I just can't be still. So by caring for others, I care for myself. Helping others is simply the only thing that has brought me peace and joy throughout my life. Looking back, I realized that I should have asked for more help. I tried to do everything myself, which is why I would become so tired. People did not like the way that I managed things, and that is ultimately why I resigned from the American Red Cross. I wish I would have trusted that more people held the same values as I did and allowed them to help me in my journey. I hope that you've enjoyed my story, and I will leave you with this quote. You must never so much think as whether you like it or not, whether it is bearable or not. You must never think of anything except the